Welcome back to Brown County in Focus. I'm Jeff Flint, Brown County Deputy Executive, joined as always by Brown County Executive Troy Streckenbach. And Troy, today we're going to have an interesting conversation today about a department that a lot of times doesn't get major publicity, but when you need them, and they're front and center.
Yeah, it's one of those departments where you don't really want to know that you have it because they're only around when there's generally an emergency and helping the municipalities and the public. But we use the Emergency Management Department as an educational opportunity for both the agencies that provide public safety and also at the same time to the public. And you probably have seen a number of our, over the last number of years, you've probably seen whether it's coming into winter or tornado season, we put out press releases and hold informational sessions to kind of make the public aware, before they're heading out. And we'll talk about that today in this episode with Mr. Kane.
Daniel Kane, who's the Director of Brown County Emergency Management. Dan, good afternoon. Good to see you. How are you?
Good afternoon, guys. Very good. Thank you for having me. It's very much an honor to be on here and be able to share our story and what we're all about. And hopefully the community can take something away from it and learn something about us. So yeah, appreciate being here.
We're glad to have you here, Dan. And you definitely provide a very good in-depth review and things that people should be thinking about when they're traveling or, like with the winter, what should you have at home? So we'll get into a number of those things. But before that, let's just talk a little bit about emergency management and how are you created, who created you, and how is it that you're under the county? And more importantly, how do you get funding?
Yeah, all good questions. So it's got an interesting history, but it's a short history overall when you look at it. Only about 75 years that we've been in an official discipline. It's a short history, about 75 years. It started during the Cold War, in response to the Cold War, and they created departments called the Civil Defense. The federal government looked at this. This is a real threat that we have, right, in terms of this nuclear war. Underpinnings were really going on at that time back in the 50s. And the federal government said, well, we're entering a new territory here. We don't have anything to be ready for this kind of thing. What are we going to do? And so they created the Civil Defense Departments, as they were known back then, and they provided initially grant funding to the states at that time to be able to carry out the mission of the civil defense agencies. And so Wisconsin and other states then ratified their own state laws to implement emergency management at the state level and subsequently the county levels and so forth. And so the states adopted their own civil defense statutes in 1951. As part of that, Wisconsin's law said each county shall have an emergency management office or department. And so that's why we have 72 different counties. Also, we have 72 different emergency management programs in the state. I've always kind of said, if you've seen one emergency management agency in the state, you've seen one emergency management agency in the state, because they can look very different depending on where you are. Each county has got very unique things that make them unique, and different resource needs and things like that. And so each emergency manager tailors their program kind of to the strengths and weaknesses of their own agencies and counties. And so as we move forward a few decades, President Carter in 1978, there was enough natural disasters and things happening nationwide where President Carter said, all of our response is kind of happening in silos and we're not very coordinated as a federal agency. And so they created FEMA under this idea that it would be this agency that would bring all of the partners together. And as a federal response, it could really be more coordinated when it comes to these types of responses. And so FEMA gets created, and it's trying to find its way through for several decades. And it gets better into the 90s. It starts finding its own way and things as more disasters happen. Then 2001 hits, right? And we have the terrorist attack in 9/11. And that was really the big shift from what we saw really with civil defense and things of that nature to more of what it is what we see today in emergency management programs. And then President Bush, after the reports came out and they identified what things that they needed to improve upon, they created the Department of Homeland Security. As now where currently FEMA sits and provides that funding to us from that agency down to the states and to the counties. So looking back, in that short amount of time from 2001 to now, really there was two big things we've really learned. And one was codified under President Obama, who said, listen, we have to have an all-hazards approach to emergency preparedness as a country. We can't just be about war or hurricanes on the coast or terrorism in major cities. As a country, we need to be ready to handle all threats and all hazards that could affect us. And so as we start moving into the new age of cyber and all these other things, we need to be ready for all things. So that was the first part. The other one was under President Bush. He said, we need to have a national framework by which to do this, right? We're going to prepare for these things, but how do we get that done? And so they created a national framework comprised of something called NIMS, the National Incident Management System. And within that, it tells us how do we respond as both public safety and citizens to these types of disasters. What is our role? And the idea is that everybody from the highest person in the federal government down to every individual citizen has a role to play and has an equal part in preparedness. And so our job really becomes to what you mentioned earlier. We've got kind of two major roles. One is working with our government partners and all those folks and stakeholders to make sure that their plans and procedures and things are up to date and that they're trained and well known, as well as working with the public to know what is their role in this whole thing and how can they best set themselves up for success if they're impacted by one of these things.
And I think it's a really important distinction as you kind of went through the history of your agency and ultimately a county function is you're more of a preparation, planning, education for both helping the local agencies. We live in a state of home rule. So if in the event there's, let's just use the flooding that we experienced. Flooding was happening in a number of the municipalities, but ultimately the city of Green Bay was experiencing the most. They are the home rule. Theoretically, they could open up the operating center and they would coordinate all efforts up to the point where they felt they weren't able to handle it, and they would call in perhaps somebody else. But I don't know if City of Green Bay ever doing that. They're well trained. They're large enough as an organization and an agency to be able to handle large events. We certainly saw that with the NFL draft. But kind of just talk about what your authority in terms of how you operate. You're managing training, you're managing preparation, education, but authorization either comes from the municipality of home rule or from perhaps the sheriff's office, the medical examiner. Why don't you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you bring up an interesting point that us in emergency management have been kind of tossing this around for a while, and it's in the term emergency management. I think a lot of times it gets a connotation of management and leadership, and certainly there's aspects of our job that have that, but we're really more emergency coordinators is really what we are, and we're coordinators of a lot of different things, but our role is, yes, and we talked about state statutes earlier. The state statute says each city, village, and town shall have their own emergency management person, director, whatever you want to title them, as well as their own emergency plan. And so it starts and ends with each city, village, and town. Where we come in is we want to work with each municipality. This is talking the government side now. We want to work with each municipality to say, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What things do you have? What do you not have? And then starting with a plan, let's put that into a plan. Let's identify what you have and what you don't, and try to then fill in the gaps of things you don't have with some resources. So we would bring in some county assets to maybe augment some of that. If you're a small town, you just don't have a lot of resources, then maybe the county could be a resource potentially for you in some of these different areas. And our plan is broken up into several sections. And the idea is that we want to create a good, solid plan at the local level. And then we want to organize that plan in a way that we identify who in the plan is going to be responsible for the different things that they're responsible for. Do they know that they're responsible for them? And then are they trained? I'm told I'm in this plan. I'm responsible for this piece of it. And now I've been trained on this specific thing that I'm going to be doing. And then we exercise it. And then we'll exercise that plan and say, all right, how well did it work? And in every exercise we have, we'll find things that we'll throw a scenario out there. We'll run it through the grinder and say, these 3 things we did really well, but these 2 things we could use some help on. And we know where we can fill the gaps in. And we just keep working. It's a circular cycle, right? And then we go back to the plan, update the plan, go back and go through the whole process. And so we're doing that with each municipality, trying to figure out, again, how to best set them up for success.
And a lot of times the municipalities have different things happening in their community, such as, whether it's a utility or it's a private sector company that has, a certain chemical, and it's their responsibility to know what's in their community. They have to do an inventory, and then they, depending on what that is, they actually have to have a plan, correct?
Yeah. Specific to chemicals, there's a legislation called EPCRA, the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, that was born out of a chemical explosion out of India, and it was the most deadly worldwide chemical release of all time, and killed thousands. Ultimately, what that resulted in was the government saying, listen, it's important that the community know and the public know and response agencies know what's in their community for dangerous chemicals. And so they're required to report each facility that has a chemical that's on a list kept by the EPA. It's deemed extremely hazardous. So it's bad enough where it's not just a hazardous chemical. They deem it extremely hazardous. And they've got a certain amount of it on site at any given time. They're required to report that into the state, and we are supposed to create a plan for them to make sure that that information is known, and facility has their own things in place to be able to respond. And so the plan is laid out that way. And it's also, again, for the community and the partners to know what's in their communities. So it's a good thing.
Right. And you mentioned that, these exercises, I know that we've had a number of different exercises that we've done. We did an exercise out at the airport. We'd done one out at Bay Beach with the different municipalities and state agencies. And they've covered the gamut in terms of situations that may arise. Why don't you talk a little bit about that coordination and how you play a role in helping those events take place?
It's interesting. When we build these exercises, we generally care less about the scenario itself and more about what do we want to test. And that goes back to what we talked about with the planning aspect of it, right? So we've got this plan, and we know we've got some issues we want to address in the plan. We want to exercise those things. So we'll set up, well before the exercise, we'll go ahead and set up objectives. All right, these are the 3 things we want to test to make sure that they're operationally sound, that they work as intended, and so on and so forth. And so each exercise has got a core set of objectives that we're looking to test and make sure that they work. From there, then we build in all the other things, who the stakeholders are going to be, who's going to be playing, what's their role, so on and so forth. And then we actually do the exercise. And so then we'll actually build a scenario from that. Generally, these exercises are large enough. We have so many different stakeholders that are playing, so we want to build in different things that can hone in on exactly what we want to test. Because you could build any number of scenarios, right, that could affect, you talked about all hazards earlier. I could build an infinite amount of scenarios affecting an infinite amount of different possibilities. And so we don't have that happen in exercise play. We're focusing in on drilling into these course of objectives and then playing that out. And so, yeah, we've had things like active threat trainings or natural disaster response are really popular, and cyber is becoming a big one now. And so we want to try to figure out what are the most important things that need addressing in our plan and work backwards from there into the scenario itself.
When you talk about those plans, and obviously there's situations where the event is growing at a sizable amount of communication and need for coordination, the county, in partnership with our municipalities, created the Emergency Operations Center, the EOC. When have you activated that, and what do you see your role in overseeing that center?
Our Emergency Operations Center is a place where, as I talked about earlier, there's this national system, right? NIMS created this national system. How do we respond to incidents? And essentially it works this way. The first responders who are on the ground control that incident from the beginning to the end. And so they're in charge of, this is what I've got in front of me, these are the resources I need, this is how we're going to handle it. And so they set it up in terms of organization is all kind of pre-scripted. There then becomes a certain point where as the event grows, maybe in size, complexity, or duration, maybe it's over multiple days, or there's just so many different other stakeholders, maybe not directly public safety agencies that don't respond 24/7 to things. They might be needed for something. As these things grow, they would call upon an Emergency Operations Center to help augment what's going on the ground. So while the firefighters are putting out the fire, the police are taking care of the bad guy, so on and so forth, right? Just these simple analogies. The Emergency Operations Center can be doing the extra work of what are the ripple effects. It's thinking about this event is happening, what ripple effects are taking place as a result of this. So think of things like media that need to be coordinated, or public messaging out to the public needs to take place. There might be some logistical needs, or we will bring in stakeholders, usually department heads, leadership of different agencies into one room to help coordinate that response. And so,
such as like our Human Services Department, public health, nonprofits, like Red Cross, agencies that are out there that help in addressing community needs as they arise. So if we talk about maybe a fire, how do we find shelter? If we're talking about lack of electricity or a mass casualty, we bring in different people into that center to try to help coordinate those efforts.
Yeah, you tailor it based on the need of what's going on. And that incident commander, unified command group on the ground will usually tell us, hey, we need help with X, Y, and Z, right? They're the ones on the ground. They know what they kind of need for resource support. So they'll tell us, we need these 3 things. And then we open up the EOC, we can start coordinating those efforts a little bit. And so back to the emergency coordinator piece, it's a supporting agency to our public safety partners on the ground that are dealing with the immediate response.
Do you have any example when you've actually needed to open it up?
Yeah, a couple times. Just this year in October, we had a missing child that was missing for about 7 to 8 hours. They called for the activation of the EOC. We had a specialty team come out comprised of various law enforcement partners, and we activated that to kind of be the coordinating hub for that response. It was a good resolution to that case, but that was the most recent one we had. That was a couple-hour activation for that. Previous to that, we had the NFL draft, as you mentioned. That was in April. That was a 3-day activation during the duration of the NFL draft itself. Prior to that, 2024, we did an activation for a winter storm. We mentioned that a little bit earlier. There was a pretty widespread power outage in the county due to this winter storm, and it was regional. It wasn't even just Brown County. That response was really, we're focused on, we had widespread power outage, lines down. People maybe were trapped in their house for a couple days. People with durable medical equipment that might have some needs. We're trying to identify these people and see what kind of help they might need, make sure we get the message out. Do you need anything? Can we support you in any way? So on and so forth. The biggest one, notably, in the last 5 years would have been COVID. And that was almost a multi-year activation of sorts. And I know emergency managers across the country were working a lot of hours through that event, just trying to coordinate, because now we're shifting from an event that's, we're usually used to police and fire that are the ones that are on the ground responding. They're the ones asking for all the support. And now we've moved to a situation where public health is the lead agency, and they're the ones in the chair. And so less familiar, not that they're not completely unfamiliar with these things, but they do these less than public safety agencies do. And so making sure they have the resources and support they need to be successful. And then we've had a few near misses. 2024, we had 2 tornadoes, one in Outagamie and one in Kashina, just north of us. Those were both a few tornadoes that just narrowly missed our borders in 2024. And then they had a major flash flood event in Appleton and Wapaka. The one in Wapaka created a dam failure that was pretty notable in terms of news coverage, and it impacted quite a big area down there in Wapaka. So that one just missed us. And then 2025, another tornado in Ocano, just north of us. And then the Milwaukee event that we've all heard about now, the once-in-a-thousand-year flood in Milwaukee. That was really a 2-part event. The north part of it skirted us to the north and went into Door County, with several tornadoes that happened up in Door County. And then to the south, the Milwaukee incident. A couple of notable statistics from that flooding event: about $11 million in private damages as a result of that incident. So think this is private homes, $11 million there. 4,000 total homes were damaged, that they came up with 18,000 calls for assistance. And so you look at an event like that and the coordination it takes to identify what the need is and how to respond and get people back on their feet as quickly as possible. That's a big part of what emergency management is and what we do.
What's the threshold in order to access state dollars, emergency dollars, and what's the threshold in order to pull down from the federal government? We just recently saw that the administration stated that they weren't going to reimburse the state of Wisconsin. I don't know the reasons behind it. I just saw it. But it is a situation where I know that when Pulaski and Wrightstown had tornadoes go through their community a number of years ago, the message from emergency management to the first responders and municipality, Public Works, all of them. As a matter of fact, I remember Hobart when they had some tornadoes come through. Keep track of all of your expenses that are associated with this event, because we need to be able to add it up and determine whether or not it's enough for us to be able to pull down from the state or the federal dollars. Talk about those thresholds.
Yes, Door County was denied. They're appealing that claim, and I think they have justification for that. There's all of their damage and things were eligible into that category of work, and so hopefully they'll be able to get that money. In terms of the state itself, so we have 2 different pots. We're very fortunate in Wisconsin. We actually have a state disaster fund called the Wisconsin Disaster Fund. Not every state has this. That's going to be for public sector damages. So think of your public buildings, your roads, things like that, debris clearance measures, things that are in public right-of-ways. That money can be tapped into after a disaster, and that is only required at about a $3.80 some cents per capita. So based on your jurisdiction, if you're a smaller town, it doesn't take much, maybe a couple $1,000s for you to maybe have a road washout or something like that. Where these small towns, they don't have a lot of necessarily disposable income, right? And so anything that they can get back in terms of something that maybe isn't just town-wide, city-wide, that type of a thing, but it's enough of an impact that it would really affect their budget, their bottom line, and their ability to recover. That's a great program for them. And so we work with the state. There's a couple different programs specific to roads that we can tap into. And one program specifically called Disaster Damage Aid, that's through the Transportation Department, allows us for some mitigation. So maybe there's a culvert that's too small in an area. Maybe this program could allow us to not only repair the road, but also increase the culvert size and maybe prevent that from happening again. So we're looking at that as options. And then in terms of the state, so if we have something local, we'll try to tap into that disaster fund, right? And in the county's case, $3.80 some percent per capita times, 275,000, just do the math, right? As a state, we need to hit currently about $11 million in public sector damage for the governor to be able to declare a disaster and be able to get recoupment funds from the federal government. And so that's kind of our number. And this is with a number that when I'm doing presentations a lot of the time out in the public for outreach, I'll let them know. We don't want there to be a misconception that FEMA's just going to come in on their white horse and refund everybody's full house payments or reimburse them for everything that they're going to have lost. The maximum payout for FEMA is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $40,000 to $45,000 is the maximum, with an average payout of only about $3,000 to $5,000. When you look at the average, it's not much. It's enough to get you by for that first couple of weeks, maybe have while your home was getting investigated or appraised, and to get a place over your head, maybe repair, maybe some utility work, but it's not going to bring you back whole. One of the things that I'm very encouraged to see from the state perspective, and this came out of the Milwaukee incident, new legislation at the state level that's being proposed. It just got proposed within the last couple of weeks, and it's moving very quickly. So we're keeping our ear to the ground on this, but a state individual assistance program is now being proposed. That would allow us the ability to get money to individual citizens much quicker than having to go through that whole FEMA process. So if that could go through, that would be a great program for us to be able to expeditiously get that. And then the idea would be if FEMA dollars were able to come in, there wouldn't be a duplication. They would then pay back the money back to the state and they would get FEMA. But it's a way to fill that gap. We talked about gap fillings earlier. It's a way to fill that gap of that need of there's so many, more often than not, these type of events do not reach a national threshold. They just don't have the dollar figures to get there. And so we have a big backlog of cases and of incidents that just never meet it, and just there's no funding stream to support them. And this would be one way to fill that gap.
And that's where coordinating with nonprofits and at the same time, homeowners, renters should all have insurance. To make sure that they're covered in these type of events. Now, we're very fortunate to have a very giving community and helping, and we all pray that we don't have to have these situations or have to open up the EOC. But briefly talk about the NFL draft and how your office was used to help support the NFL draft. Basically the city of Green Bay's fire department, their police department, the sheriff's office, the village of Ashwaubenon, and the Green Bay Packers.
Our real goal early on was to set again, we talked about objective setting earlier. We need to start setting some objectives in our planning cycles and figure out what it is that we need to get done in coordination with the Packers and the NFL, being the first time we've done this. We're not unfamiliar with Lambeau events, right? We've done these quite often. So we didn't have to start from zero. We were able to start quite a bit of ways ahead in terms of that process. But the draft just being as unique as it is, there were some things we had to get ironed out. So we worked in the planning process for probably over a year, did different types of trainings specific to sports management and that type of a thing. And then actually the draft itself, our role ended up being that support role. We're typically during a general Packer game, we won't activate our emergency operations center for that. But for the case of the draft, we decided that it was important to make sure that we were on the balls of our feet for this thing and that we had the key resources and things in place so that we talked about that command structure earlier, that command structure on the ground had all the support ready at their fingertips if they needed it for something to respond for this event. And so the EOC was there as bringing in over 30 different agencies into the fold for that event to make sure that we had on the ready all the different types of contingency aspects to what we could possibly see for this event in place and ready to go. And they were all coordinated and briefed so that we weren't cold calling somebody at 4:00 in the afternoon on a weekend where they were out of town or something like that. We wanted to make sure that we were ready to go and had everybody in place at a moment's notice and that they were briefed in and ready to go. So that was really our role for that event. And by all accounts, was a very successful event in terms of overall safety. And when I heard, everybody had a good time.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, the planning that everyone did, and I don't know how much of the planning you were part of the transportation network, but I remember calling Jeff on my way out to Turtle School in Oneida for an event, asking him to go onto the state's camera system on the highway system to see if there's any traffic. And his response back, because when I was driving out there on 172, I noticed that there just didn't seem to be, it looked like a normal business day. And Jeff's response was, yeah, it's looks like business as usual, a normal day in Green Bay. And the next thing I know, 2 or 3 hours later, I see on the TV, there's people standing in a line and it's, filling up really quickly, yet you didn't feel it. They did an amazing job coordinating drop points, busing, all those pieces of the puzzle worked really, really well. And I'm not sure if you had any real active role in that. The second thing that we noticed, just a general bystander, was it just felt really safe. It felt like a great event that lasted for 3 days.
Yeah, and I think the planning really showed through, and it was encouraging to see that there were a couple times where there were some tense moments, but for the most part, the planning just kicked in, and we had contingencies for every little thing, and we were able to move from 1A to 1B and keep the show moving as intended. And so the planning was incredible. And you mentioned it. Hats off to those transportation folks. I've been in so many different meetings with those guys that I'm not leading them, right? But it's important for me to know what the process is, what the program is, and so we can build contingencies around, if this happens, what are we going to do to backfill? The NFL has got full-time paid engineers that look at this stuff well in advance, and I was told that, hey, yeah, guys looking at this thing. And I'm like, have they been to Green Bay, though? Have they seen the way we operate around here, how clogged things can get? And so talking with them, I just got more and more confidence as we went on. But I'll be honest, I was sweating a little bit too. And I started looking at we had those cameras up in the EOC and looking at those things. It looked less busy than a Packer game. So I couldn't believe it myself. That was probably my biggest surprise as well, quite honestly, from that whole thing, was how well that thing operated. Yeah, very happy overall with the success of that event.
We'll have more of our interview with Emergency Management Director Dan Kane right after this.
Hi, it's Angela with the New Zoo and Adventure Park, and I'm here to remind you of all the fun stuff that we have to do during the fall months. The zoo and the canopy tour are both open every single day of the year. We open at 9 a.m. and have a ton of stuff for you to see and enjoy. We also have a couple of evening events on the canopy tour that you can check out and enjoy. And of course, you're welcome to consider booking a private program with us, like one of our wild encounters. Even when the weather starts to cool down, we still have plenty to do and see here. So be sure to stop on out and visit us. You can check out all the details on newzoo.org.
Welcome back to Brown County in Focus. I'm Jeff Flint, Brown County Deputy Executive, joined by Brown County Executive Troy Streckenbach and our guest today, Emergency Management Director Dan Kane. Dan, coming up pretty quickly right upon us is going to be Winter Weather Awareness Week. Talk a little bit about the week itself and the message you want to get out, but some of the important things that people need to be aware of.
Winter is coming.
Yes, right.
Oh, yeah.
Game of Thrones. So yeah, being prepared. And I think sometimes we hear it in our profession. Preparedness can sometimes have a negative connotation when it comes to preppers or overdoing it with things, right? But I want to make sure I stress the importance that being prepared is really not about being in a consistent state of paranoia or fear, but rather should be a comforting thing that you should be able to feel that you have a peaceful mind knowing that you put yourself or your family in the best possible position that you should be versus if you're impacted by an event. And so with that framework, we generally preach a very similar message across when we talk about all disasters. There's kind of three main things that we try to preach. The first is being informed. And so I asked the National Weather Service very recently, what is the outlook for winter this year? It's important to kind of know what we could expect. And they're looking at above average snowfall for the year. They're thinking it could be the way the weather patterns are setting up, increased chance for that. So I guess get your shovels and snowplows ready, have enough salt on hand, that type of thing. So the first thing we talk about is being informed. We want to know the difference between watches and warnings. Understand that a watch means that the conditions are present for an event to happen, and a warning means that they're actively happening. And so when we talk about things like winter weather, if there's a winter storm warning in place, you should be reevaluating if you want to even get out on the roads at that point in time, because that means it's actively happening. Don't find yourself getting caught in the middle of something, leaving, thinking you got those two mixed up. And that understand if you're in a watch, you're still okay, but be ready to go and move if you need to. And a warning means it's actively happening. Or if there's an ice storm warning, again, these are threats. The Weather Service has no more powerful language than a warning to indicate that something is happening. So understand that's the most powerful verbal tool they have at their disposal to indicate that there's danger out there. The other thing is to heed those travel warnings, as I mentioned. Check 511 before you go. That will give you the latest information on road conditions. The sheriff's office might deem that the situation on the ground is just too dangerous to travel or to have tow trucks out, so they might issue a tow ban. So understand that if there's instances where the weather is just too bad, if you go off into the road, into a ditch, you might be on your own for quite a while until the weather gets better. And so understand that that's a real thing and be prepared for that. And if you have to travel, it's really important that you let somebody else know where you're going and what route you'll take and when to expect a check-in, because that way you're able, if they don't hear from you by that point, it just could get you maybe resources that much faster. Maybe, God forbid, you get knocked out, or if you don't have a cell phone or something like that, it's important for people to be able to know where you are. Have multiple ways to get alerts as well. Don't just rely on one service like a phone. Those things die. Have other avenues such as weather radios, weather apps, TV radio, and so on and so forth. Have multiple ways to receive those alerts. The second thing I would say is, we talk about this every year, is making a kit specific to winter weather. Some things to be thinking about for a winter at-home kit would be 3 days of non-perishable food, 3 days of water. We talked about that winter storm in 2024. People had power lines down across their roads. They couldn't get repaired, and so they were live lines. And so they were trapped kind of in their cul-de-sac for a couple of days before those lines could get repaired. You just never know when you're going to be needing that. So have that available. Weather radios are a good option, batteries, and a backup phone battery. Again, we talked about phones needing to be used. You might not have power, and so do you have a backup battery for your phone? flashlight, extra heavy blankets, winter gear, first aid kit, fire extinguishers, and medications. And then for a vehicle kit, we kind of preach 2 different kits, an at-home kit and a vehicle kit. A vehicle kit could contain things like a cell phone charger, water, first aid kit, flashlights, batteries, vest or road flares, tow rope, jumper cables, and an ice scraper. And there's information on these kits both on our website or at readywisconsin.gov for more if you want to know more about those. But all those things could be things that maybe are just comfort items that help you get through if you're stranded, or they might actually save your life depending on the current conditions of what's going on. So it's important to have these things at the ready when you need them. And the final part is having a plan. We talk about emergency management all the time. You want to have a plan for things ahead of time. Shut off your water, your outside lines at your home to prevent broken water pipes. We want to make sure that we keep exterior pipes clear of snow and debris to prevent the CO2 backup in your home. And know where your main water and gas shutoffs are in case you have a leak, and make sure there's fresh batteries and all CO2 and smoke alarms. And if possible, have your furnace and chimney inspected annually. If possible, keep half tank of gas in the tank. You prevent freezing or running out of gas during a snowstorm, and know where you can find an alternate source of power if there's a long-term outage. And this is one of the ones where if you have durable medical equipment, for example, talk to your medical provider about your power outage plan. How are you going to get access to either battery backups, or what is going to be the plan for you to get your equipment powered or refrigerated medications covered? What's the plan going to be for that? Some municipalities may offer, warming stations or charging stations. Check with your municipality on that, on if they are going to offer something like that at the local level. And generator use, we see this a lot. Any generators, please make sure you run those outdoors, never in a garage. That can lead to significant health hazards with CO2 issues. And so just a couple of things, little tips and tricks that we try to preach when it comes to winter weather readiness. And again, nothing that is overbearing, but something that can put you in a better position should one of these things happen to you.
You say it's simple, but there's a lot of information. Where can they find that?
ReadyWisconsin.wi.gov has a great breakdown of all these different things by section. Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, the reality is that if you're traveling out in the rural areas and it's snowing or there's a warning, you really should have that toolkit in your vehicle, something to stay warm. One breakdown, and if you're in a rural area and you may not have coverage, these are just important things to happen. As you mentioned, it could save your life.
It's a lot of information, but it's all useful things that can really help you. And we've got more, I tell this to a lot of people too, is we've got more access to technology and resources in today's world than we've ever had before. And so you should definitely be taking advantage of every tool you have at your disposal. No reason not to, if it helps improve your safety or well-being.
Mr. Kane, thank you for joining Brown County. You've been with us how long?
Just about 2.5, 3 years now.
2.5 years, and was working up in Door County, ironically. And so we appreciate your interest and dedication to helping Brown County first responders and citizens best be prepared. But a lot of good information here, and we really, truly appreciate what you bring to the table, Dan. So thank you.
Troy, thank you for sitting down with us today, and we'll be back next time with more information, more public service from Brown County in Focus.